it goes much deeper than that. Our Constitution that guarantees our God-given rights, that guarantees our government will not impose upon those things. Within the last 4 years, I've seen high public officials of the United States government scoff at the idea that our Constitution and Bill of Rights have anything to do with the decisions they make.
What good does gold do me anyway? I can't use it for anything.
Well, I think I found a form you might appreciate.
Wow. That's beautiful. Wow, I can wear that just about anywhere.
And you can take it with you through airport security and across borders. It's small and compact and lightweight, and you can even hand it down through generations. Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/RP.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions. Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're always honored to have this returning guest. Wayne Jett is the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. It's a massive volume of research and scholarly expose of the inglorious history of our country's finances and how they've been engineered against the common person. It's available by hardcover through his website, classicalcapital.com, and also on ebook form through Amazon. Wayne, thanks for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Very happy to be back, Dunnigan. Thank you for having me.
We wanted to have you back on to talk about a couple of major events that are unfolding before our eyes, in some ways unprecedented in U.S. history. First of all, a ongoing attempt of a U.S. presidential coup. Can you tell us about what the latest research is that you're finding out about what events are unfolding in Washington, and will they overturn the mandate and the will of the majority of the people?
Well, I think there's certainly an effort well underway, but we've seen it, we've witnessed it for the last 2 years. Yes, there has certainly been an attempt to undo the election, to avoid and, in effect, nullify the presidency of Donald Trump. The most recent development I've seen, and I regard as highly significant. Of course, last week, I think most of your listeners will know that the president issued an executive order ordering the intelligence agencies and the FBI to cooperate with the Attorney General in declassifying documents relating to the surveillance against his campaign and the accusations that have been made against him, so that the public will know what the origin of those things were, to the extent the government already knows them. What I regard as a serious aftermath of that order by the president is an interview yesterday by a lawyer, a man that I respect very much, although I don't know him, Joe DeGeneva, former U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. He has been, I'm very happy to say, very public in his views and analysis about this whole coup situation for the last year or more. I first became aware of him. Actually, I became aware of his wife, who is also his law partner. The two of them, I think, are probably, well, in my opinion, they are the best qualified criminal white-collar defense lawyers in Washington, D.C. That's a mouthful, because so much of federal law relates to criminality of various actions done with respect to the government or with respect to the people. And in that circumstance, the fact that he has been very vocal in expressing his observations about the operations of law enforcement. These are people that he's dealt with for his career, both federal agencies and District of Columbia authorities and so forth. And he made a statement yesterday after the president's executive order that these agencies cooperate with the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of the country, in providing information relating to the surveillance of his campaign and the surveillance of other Americans, so that the Attorney General could review those things and order actions as necessary to enforce the law, to defend the Constitution, and take all appropriate actions according to the Attorney General's situation. Now, what Joe DeGenova said yesterday in a radio interview is that his information is that there are officials, high officials of both the intelligence agencies and the FBI, including specifically the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, who are failing or refusing to cooperate in that order and to comply with it, in that they continue to hold back information that Attorney General Barr requires in order to carry out the president's order. Now, in my estimation, that not only is a breach of the responsibilities in the offices that they hold, but I don't see how it is not, if there is a clear, direct declaration of a refusal to perform their duties and follow the orders of the president, it seems to me we're talking not just about the idea or theory of a coup. We're talking about a direct action in the nature of a coup and an act of treason. So coming from Mr. DeGenova, with his experience and his capabilities in analyzing what is going on, I regard that as a very significant matter, and one that could result in actions that actually go beyond my capabilities to really determine what they would be. But we're talking about the prospect of military conflict between our military, our intelligence, that sort of thing. All of these agencies certainly have significant weaponry power at their of various natures, and so the idea that there is that kind of conflict at the top of our government is highly significant. The most serious events I've seen, except for out-and-out wars that begin killing people immediately among our population because of the loss of our military forces. This is extremely important in our constitutional history, and I'm certainly looking to the next actions to be taken. This particular statement, of course, was made by Mr. DeGenova, and the actions he was reporting were taking place while the president was outside the country. I might say in that regard, while we're generally on this aspect of the topic, that I thought there was an important message to be conveyed in a Twitter post just made by Q yesterday, I believe, showing a scene on a street. He posted a link showing a scene on a street, I believe in Tokyo. It was a Japanese demonstration, one that was confined to a particular area of the sidewalk that was about maybe 20 feet or so wide, and you really couldn't see much in terms of how many people were there. But right in front of them on the side of the camera was a big poster a big Trump 2020 campaign banner, and just above it, with all the people standing right by it, was a sign that said, "Thank you, America, for what was the term? Liberating Japan." Now, I want to say what is the obvious. That is a highly potent message. Since when have we been told by the major media that Japan has needed liberation in a way that the United States could deliver, or that the President of the United States might have been called upon to do that? And how is it that the Japanese people are aware of that and we are not? Now, I'd like to put that into the context of other messages that we have had of a similar nature in the past 2 years. The one that comes to mind is another country in that area, North Korea, and we've had some messages or insinuations that indeed what was involved in our negotiations with North Korea has very much amounted to, in many ways, although unseen to most Americans or many Americans, that North Korea has been a captive nation, not a terrorist nation, not a renegade nation, as we've been led to believe, but a captive nation, one that has been captive by the deep state that appears to be threatening our presidency at the present time. That is, that the North Korean negotiations that appeared to be so all of a sudden so fruitful, perhaps, with such great potential, we were brought around to the understanding that North Korea had been a captive nation, that its leadership had been captive of the deep state, and that what the president had been doing during his first 2 years, in part, was freeing the North Korean government from the captive state of affairs of the deep state, so that they indeed could pursue the best interests of their country, so they could pursue a peaceful relationship with all countries, rather than being put in the position of always being the outlaw and so forth. We've talked about that, I think, before in our discussions. But that is of the same nature that, in effect, North Korea's people and its leadership were not the captives of the people there. They were also the captives of the deep state, being told what to do and what to say and what image to project at the threat of death, which, of course, on more than one occasion has affected the selection and the survival of their leadership. In that circumstance, it comes into play that there's certainly reason to believe that the Japanese economy and the government has been the captive of the global cabal, just as the United States of America is, in my opinion. The great Japanese companies that have become such major conglomerates in the world arena. Who are they owned by? I would say very likely members of the cabal. It's certainly been reported by others for years. For example, that Sony, what many of us, probably including myself for years, just thought must have some significance in the Japanese culture as a word, also happens to be the initials of the Standard of New York, the oil company, the great Standard Trust, owned by the Rockefellers. And certainly the Rockefeller presence has been prominently known, although not advertised by our media. But whether it's the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, or the other members of the global cabal, it may very well be, as some have indicated for some years, that indeed Japan has been the puppet, not so much of the United States government, although there's been some aspect of that, because our government in large part has been controlled by those same cabalists. We have the prospect now that the Japanese people, at least some of them, are under the impression that America is in the process of freeing them because we have this president. So these are very historic times. They are for our country. They are for Britain. They are for Australia. They are for France. They are for Germany. What country is not affected presently by not only by the tremendously aggressive social restructuring forces of the cabal that have been just riding roughshod over every nation, trying to wipe out national identity in every respect, bringing in outsiders in every nation, including the United States of America, who do not know our culture, who do not know our constitutional precedents. This is true in so many countries around the world, and again, more or less repeating or evidencing in more and more places the point of view that 2016 was to be the closing edition of the global cabal's efforts to end individual nations and to put us all into a global dictatorship with important modifications, largely in the way of reducing population by great numbers, great proportions. So anyway, I'll put it at that and leave you a chance to ask something further if you like. I do believe it's important at this time, in terms of our concentrating on where we are and where we need to go in seizing this opportunity to move against the cabal, to eliminate the cabal, to reclaim our republic. It's very important to get as much perspective as possible on what our present economic situation, our present governmental situation is. In every important respect I see, we have been and are controlled by the global cabal. We are in a mercantilist system. We are not capitalist.
I wanted to get to that in just a moment, but before we leave this topic of in the defense of or the attack against nationalism and the sovereignty of individual states, what do you see? Because we have younger family members and meet a lot of younger generation people who talk about there's a fairly emotionally persuasive narrative that's being propagated quite heavily on universities and in the media and in entertainment and so on, that goes something like this. It's like, you see populist, nationally patriotic candidates like President Trump, or like those who want to be a Brexit, leaving the European Union and so on, and they're saying, this surge of nationalism is ugly because it's like the Nazi movement of the 1940s, and so now we want to have this. The beautiful alternative is globalism because it's embracing and it's bringing fairness to people who have been treated unfairly, and it's redressing the wrongs that done in the past. What do you see this dynamic playing out of this narrative of that sovereignty of the health of individual nations is being smeared with, basically tarring it with the Nazi analogy, whereas saying that the only thing to do that's virtuous is to do globalism because it's the way of the future?
Well, I hope that rhetoric bringing up Nazism is sort of the dying gasp of the cabal, because I'll tell you, in my estimation, the message is loud and clear. The European nations, Australia, across the world, the people of the country
The people.
are speaking loudly and clearly. They are sick of having this globalism imposed upon them, and they're sick of having their women and their children overrun, raped and killed by people from outside their culture that they don't know, who don't appreciate the niceties and the great advancements in human conduct that have come about over the years with a great deal of hard work and sacrifice and even warring and defense of their cultures in order to make things better. I would say that the Scandinavian nations, how much more needs to be said about what they've been enduring, and in large part, I have to say that a lot of what's been done has been empowered by the wars that have been imposed in the Middle East, partly with the governmental participation of the United States, but also with the European governments, the same ones that have formed this. You want to talk about fascism? Let's talk about the EU and what they've done there. I mean, they don't even allow voting on their officials, and they're imposing economic conditions and social conditions of every kind on all of those countries. Now, tell me how that is an improvement in living conditions and social conditions across that entire continent. I don't see much about what was going on in Europe except for the militarism and war that resulted. And frankly, there's some revisionist history of World War II going on and World War I that I think ought to be given important attention, because what we've been told in the West has not at all been necessarily the truth. I'm having a hard time finding truth that we've been told by our government and even by our historians in most cases on purpose. Ordinarily, they've been heroic revelations by people who sacrificed themselves in order to get information out, and even when they do, it's often almost tragic in the depth of sacrifice that a person has to make in order to learn about it and find out about it and so forth. We're going to have to really treasure and protect and preserve our right to know information in the age of technology that we now have. We're seeing it every day in censorship of every kind and in outright lying by the so-called major media that we're supposed to trust.
That's what came to mind when you were talking about the upswelling of the yearning for autonomy and the yearning for sovereignty on the individual and the family and the nation, the national level. You said the people are certainly expressing their interest in regaining, basically reclaiming the sovereignty of their individual countries, and yet you wouldn't know that in large part by watching mainstream media, because the narrative, again, that keeps being propagated and did certainly throughout the presidential elections here in 2016, which ended up like blindsidedly being surprised when Trump got elected, because the odds-on favorite, the hands down, was going to be Hillary Clinton, because that's what we were being told and fed was going to be everybody, the will of the people, and only a few. What was it called? not despicables. I'm trying to think of what it was. The
Deplorables.
Deplorables, yes. The basket of deplorables were the only oddball fringe people who were going to be supporting someone like Trump. But back on this topic of revisionist history, are there some specific examples? Because it sounds like you were certainly thinking of some examples in your mind. Are there one or two examples you can point to that people can relate to? That, oh yeah, that's right, that's what we were taught, but you believe things didn't actually happen that way?
I would point out, I just reviewed or read within the last week a writing by Paul Craig Roberts, relatively short, a summary of a book of history about World War II, in which he identifies quite a number of very notable differences in the activities of the various nations and their leadership, particularly Churchill and Hitler in those critical years leading up to and into the first aspects of the Second World War. And I would just call attention to that. It's longer than I can go into here at this point,
okay.
But are quite remarkable in terms of the particular point being made that there were ways to avoid the war. It was not in the analysis of that historian, and I think I don't believe I'm misstating the views expressed by Paul Craig Roberts, Dr. Roberts, in this particular instance, that it appears that there's quite convincing evidence that there were provocations for the war, pursuits of the war, not for the purpose of freedom of the people, not for the purpose of defending Britain or the United States and so forth, but for other imperial types of goals of the global cabal again. It's the kind of thing that ought to be looked at more carefully than we can handle in this particular interview. But with all of the Americans, all of the people of so many countries that were brought into that terrible killing that was done supposedly in order to defend the freedoms of our country, it reminds me of some of the arguments being made now that our freedoms are to be defended by taking exactly the kinds of actions that take our freedoms away.
Oh, like the Patriot Act, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
That's correct. And so in those circumstances, yes, there are many aspects of history. The ones that I feel I've got the most to contribute about are the ones that I've done the research on myself, that I don't know of anyone else that has done it. That's why I try to concentrate on talking about the Great Depression, because I found the actions that were done. I found the plan for it. I found the actions that any reasonable person making economic, analytical conclusions would understand these things would cause extreme poverty, distress, starvation, death, and yet they were done by the highest officials of our government, and they were done in ways that surely should have been reported by historians, economists, those responsible for teaching us the truth, who claim to have that mantle, and yet they have not been. And so this is the kind of thing that needs to be brought to bear to enable people to understand the past and what was done to our previous generations with as much malicious intent as you could imagine, and then bring that perspective to where we are now and what we must defend against, what we are facing. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Malarkey. That was untrue then, and it's certainly untrue now. We have active forces, very powerful forces, trying to act against us and overthrow our government and impose its will on the American people, partly by causing this so-called political turmoil of name-calling and so forth and so on, but it goes much deeper than that. Our Constitution that guarantees our God-given rights, that guarantees our government will not impose upon those things. Within the last 4 years, I've seen high public officials of the United States government scoff at the idea that our Constitution and Bill of Rights have anything to do with the decisions they make. I've seen that come from Supreme Court justice, one or another of them, in various ways. In fact, if you don't mind my getting a little bit personal at this point.
Sure.
The last time I was in the Supreme Court with a case, the U.S. Supreme Court, was in 1986. I think the argument might have been actually in the late months of 85, but they decided in 86. And it involved a most important clause of the Constitutional Bill of Rights, the Fifth Amendment, and the protection against taking of private property for public use without just compensation. I won't go into the aspect of that, but the case was squarely presented as to whether a federal statute could be enacted by Congress, signed by the President, taking property from private individuals, tens of thousands of them across the country, requiring them to pay it to other private parties. It was the most blatant violation of that you can design. Violation of the Fifth Amendment taking clause, protection against taking of private property. I lost that case 9-0 with a so-called conservative Justice Rehnquist as the Chief Justice, and with supposedly a majority on the court. In my estimation, that is a clear proof that the so-called conservative liberal split is a fiction, that to the extent possible, those selected for the Supreme Court are cabalist appointees. They're the ones that will not get in the way in terms of so-called protecting our rights when the cabal, the global cabal, the one that imposes mercantilism upon us, prevents us from ever having capitalism as much as we had for more than we have now in the 19th century. That is what we have had in the Supreme Court. I hope we are getting a foothold to a reformed Supreme Court that actually values the Constitution and obeys it as the fighting people of our armed forces obey it, and as they treasure it and value it. That's what we need to be looking toward, because otherwise we're going to have much more turbulent times. Nevertheless, with all of this said, I would just say that I still remain optimistic that we are making the greatest progress of my life right now in terms of our prospects and the likelihood of success. So, I mean, how exhilarating can you get in those circumstances? So,
you've mentioned a couple times in passing about how we are not a capitalist, in a capitalist opportunity, we are in a mercantile opportunity or imposition. Can you talk to us about what are the essential elements you think need to be present for capitalism, and what's missing about those, and what are we being subject to instead, and what's the effect of that subjugation?
Well, the clear proof, there are several examples of it, that we are mercantilist is we have a Rockefeller, Rothschild central bank making our so-called currency. That is absolutely the hallmark of a mercantilist system. Any country with that kind of private bank that controls a fiat currency, the fiat currency is a carefully designed instrument to steal the value of all labor and produce of an economy by issuing currency that gradually becomes worthless. It finally collapses. And so therefore, during the entire period of time that currency was in effect, the mercantilist elite wind up with all of that value in terms of hard assets that they have bought with that currency during the time it was in effect. They own those assets, and everyone else has nothing but paper, and they disappear into the wisp of the night. That is what we're facing with the U.S. dollar. So clearly, with the Fed not only having that currency and all the power that it comes with it, and our military forces to impose that currency on every country in the world, this is mercantilism, with the fangs of tigers. The next aspect of it that clearly is a mercantilist tip-off is the graduated income tax was stated to be one of the chief tools of the ruling elite to destroy the middle class. Earned income is the hallmark of the middle class. The signature of every person who works and produces to support himself and his family as independent, self-sufficient people. That is the enemy of the ruling elite. They want only slaves. They want all of those people in the middle class that earns their way destroyed, eliminated, exterminated. They said that in 1901. The income tax could immediately be repealed and would have a very, very tiny tax on financial asset transactions, probably less than 1%, would fund our entire government and every sub-government under it. And there would be no penalty for being a middle-class earning person, as is now placed on earned income of the middle class. If that's not enough, we can go right on down the line with other aspects of the death tax that confiscates wealth of any middle-class person that's not a part of the ruling elite. Those people are gone under the ruling elite's design. They said so in their manifesto of 1901. I don't have to take it of my own interpretation. I take it from their own words. Those people are to be eliminated. They have not joined with the ruling elite in exterminating the middle class as is demanded, and so they are to go as well. You go right on down the line, the charitable foundations to protect the wealth of the ruling elite, they don't get inspected by the IRS. The IRS knows its marching orders. They go after things like the Tea Party and the little foundations of the middle class that have to dot all the I's and cross the T's to qualify, or else you don't get your exemption that the major foundations do. The major foundations have no worries with the IRS. I'm quite certain. So we can go on and on about so many of the major aspects of what runs our society and what controls our intelligence and police forces and so forth and so on at the highest levels. Those are the agents of the globalist state that hopes to and plans to allow each national government to fall into crumbles and let them take over with, of course, as much death and destruction as possible. But that's the challenge that our president has, to get into place a replacement of our current Fed and monetary system with a sound money system that is certainly possible. We had it for years before the Fed was put in 1913. We can have it again, and a better one, but it remains to be done. I think the president's working on those kind of things, and I think is probably way out ahead of where I am in my understanding of how far it's advanced.
I want to tap your knowledge of history in this area that you just brought up, because my wife Melody and I were recently had the opportunity to visit Philadelphia, where we visited both the Philadelphia, we were outside the Fed building, but we also went inside the U.S. Mint there. Actually went inside both the Federal Reserve building there as well as the Mint, and I got somewhat of a tour in both places and picked up some of the literature. It's very interesting literature you pick up in the Fed building, but the version of history that they teach is that the financial history of the U.S. was very volatile, convultuous, and unstable from the forming of our country until the foundation of the Fed, with collapse after collapse after collapse. But then once the Fed came in, it's been steady and unprecedented, smooth sailing since then. Do you view that as an accurate representation of the true history, or is that a narrative that's being proposed?
No, I certainly don't regard that as valid in any respect. Quite to the contrary. They tried protecting the Fed's image through the crash and the Great Depression by not having the Fed be the laboring oar, although supposedly our recent Fed chairman, Bernanke, confessed belatedly that the Fed was responsible for it. No, that's just a cover-up. The Fed wasn't responsible for it. The executive branch was. The executive branch was one that did it. The Fed cooperated with it, but stayed out of the limelight. Actually, during the 1920s, when we had such tremendous economic growth, it was powered throughout that period. It primarily happened after Calvin Coolidge succeeded to the presidency upon the death of the elected president. It started in 1923 with a platform of cutting taxes, cutting federal income tax rates, and allowing economic growth. That Congress wouldn't agree to it, but he finally saved enough in order to cut taxes a little bit, and from then on, every year he cut taxes with the budget surplus that was produced by his actions. He finally got it down to 25% maximum rate, reducing the others even more. And in that circumstance, his son died strangely and suddenly after playing tennis at the White House, and it seemed that he got a message of some kind that he shouldn't run again. He would have won in a landslide, bigger than the landslide of Hoover in 1928 if he had run. But nevertheless, Hoover was elected on the coattails of Coolidge, and should have been a good president. He thought he was more able than anybody, but he wanted to spend money. He announced he was going to start spending the money rather than cutting taxes. The market shuddered and almost fell at that time, but recovered, and he became an implement of the global elite. He rolled over for them. I won't go into all that, but there are so many aspects of how the Fed has since, particularly after the Great Depression, it stayed undercover, under wraps. But Roosevelt, as soon as elected, ripped away the mechanism by which every American had the right to change dollars for gold at any bank at $20.67 an ounce. That was what made the dollar work and was so respected. Everybody could do that. Immediately upon taking office, federal FDR eliminated that by ordering that everyone turn in their gold. No family was permitted to have more than 1 ounce of gold remaining in its possession. Criminal penalties for violation of that executive order. So in that circumstance, from that moment on, the Fed was much more of a problem than it had been during the 20s. For example, as soon as the Federal Reserve Act was amended in 1935, it gave FDR control of the Fed board. At their first meeting of the Fed board after FDR's new appointees were appointed, they increased the bank reserve requirements aimed at small banks by 50%, which essentially required them to call in loans even if they were performing in order to meet that reserve requirement. That required, he did that effective that order was made in August of 1936, the year of his reelection, and immediately it caused another tremendous wave of closing of small banks because they couldn't survive with that reserve requirement, and foreclosures of farms and homes and so forth because they were the lenders for those loans.
Right.
As soon as he was reelected in November 36, that same board increased the reserve requirements another 33%. So in other words, by the end of those two actions, reserve requirements were triple what they were when they started. It was an outrage, allowing assets to be bought for 2 cents, 3 cents, 5 cents on the dollar, whether they were farms or homes or mines or whatever you want to call it. It was outrageous. And yet this was the kind of thing that just kind of slipped by the attention of the major media in terms of reporting that that was the effect of Roosevelt's actions. The man who was more of an elitist than any president in history by birth and by personal conduct his entire life, except for his political pronouncements that he was gifted in acting as a person of the people when he was not. He had another 9 to a dozen actions that I describe in detail in my book that were just as monstrous as that, in stripping money out of the economy, in draining money from the economy so that no one had money, so that everything could be bought from anybody at 2 to 3 to 5 cents on the dollar. And in those circumstances, why wouldn't we have a depression? Why wouldn't we be having people starve to death by the millions? And yet, what are we told by our history books? The American government was the most humanitarian in the world and looking out for its people. That was a big lie, a horrendous lie. And that's the reason I regard my book as important for people to get in their hands. It will give them more of a perspective on how to evaluate the actions that we're seeing now.
Exactly.
And the contentions, and how important it is for people to look through the so-called right-left partisanship and the angry words exchanged that way, and look what is really good for people and what is not, and who's trying to take away truth-telling and who is not. I think we're in a very important time for the entire world, and my goodness, the rest of the world recognizes it. Country after country is thanking America for liberating its people by letting them know and by taking actions to take away some of the powers that these elite have over the other countries. How do we do that? There's an executive order that I've mentioned to you in the past that freezes the assets of any person having anything to do with the corruption of human trafficking. And I think that may very well go much to the heart of much of the wealth of the global elite. We'll see whether that turns out to be the case, but I do believe that actions in that regard are very much still ongoing. We have not heard the last of them. We've hardly heard the first of them, but we will. I think that we're going to be hearing that in the quite near future, much more so than we've heard so far. And we've had, in my estimations, lots of action since the 2016 election. We know so much more now than we did then, and we're going to learn a lot more.
We've been speaking with Wayne Jett, the author of The Fruits of Graft, and he's with us here on Reluctant Preppers. Wayne, if people want to find your work, because you publish quite often scholarly articles and essays, where can they find you?
Classicalcapital.com is easy to find, and my current works, they're usually short and to a particular point, are found on that pretty easily. There are essays. I have years of essays and also of my reports going back to at least 2007. And believe it or not, I was somewhat surprised at it myself. I was writing about mercantilism being our problem back in those days, and it's in my book.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned that it wasn't promoted by the mainstream media, but I certainly, as a child growing up of parents who grew up in the Depression, in the Great Depression, definitely remember my mom in particular, who was speaking always quite bitterly about the oppression from the banking system on ordinary farmers and homeowners during that time, and it's exactly what you're describing. I did want to mention you're talking if we back up far and away from it, you're saying look at the truth, folks. Don't look at the story you've been fed. You've got to know what really happened. That waking up to the truth is partly what that metaphor of the red pill from the Matrix movie also mentions. And I have to mention that not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, the Red Pill Expo, sponsored by G. Edward Griffin, will be held. It's the third annual one. It's in Hartford, Connecticut, and that I will be there, and people would like to meet in person, please join the Red Pill Expo. Go to redpillexpo.com and register. There will also be DVDs available after the fact, but if you want to network with like-minded folks who want to know what's really happening and not just what we're being spoon-fed, check it out. I almost forgot to mention, if people go to redpillexpo.com and sign up for the conference mentioning the keyword preppers, that's PREPPERS, you get $30 off your registration. They let us announce that here, so we hopefully get more people there and see everyone there. So Wayne Jett, always a distinguished visitor here, always appreciated by our viewers, and thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
A great pleasure, and thank you for your work, Dunnigan. Very much appreciated.
Hey, Reluctant Preppers. If you haven't heard, we've already started our monthly 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle thank you gift to one active Patreon subscriber each month, signed by your host, Dunnigan Kaiser. And you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.